The morning sun cut across the sea-washed tarmac in strips, igniting the polished noses of corsairs like a row of impatient metal teeth. Bougainville's maintenance tents smelled of oil, sweat, and coffee. Men moved with that peculiar mixture of exhaustion and purpose that war breeds. A half-daunted swagger from seeing too much, and a stubborn habit of doing what must be done anyway. Engines were warmed, guns checked, and pilots ran through the same mental checklist they had recited for months, the lines of the liturgy worn into muscle. Captain James "Jimmy" Sweat walked the flight line without the swagger. He was lean under his flight jacket, a man more given to tight focus than to bravado. 3 days earlier, he'd watched a wingman roll into the jungle, trailing black smoke and the last soft scream of radio. Those images sat in his mouth like grit. He had a stack of gun camera films and after-action reports in his kit bag that nobody else wanted to look at anymore. The numbers told a single stubbornly ugly truth. They were burning rounds for nothing. Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomons had a problem that no one in Washington seemed willing to fix. The F-4U Corsair was, on paper, a beast, fast, powerful, and armed with 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns. Yet in combat, it was maddeningly inefficient. Pilots were using hundreds of rounds to score hits that barely dented an enemy plane. A whole sortie could leave a pilot out of ammunition and exposed with nothing to show for it but spent brass and stomach acid. The engineers back home had set the guns to converge at 1,000 feet, an assumption of idealized dogfights and deliberate, measurable firing. At that distance, the 6 streams of fire supposedly met and delivered their full force at a single point. It made sense on a drawing board. It made less sense when real planes at 300 miles an hour tumbled and jinked in the Pacific sky. At battle distances of a few hundred yards, bullets that were angled to meet at 1,000 feet made the burst open into a dangerous cone. Targets slipped through the gaps. Mechanics and pilots had tried tiny adjustments, experiments with 800 feet, 600 feet, but the consensus among the officers and engineers was absolute and unyielding, no lower than 500 feet. Structural safety, they said. Brackets and mountings weren't designed for the angles that closer convergence demanded. The official memos warned of hairline fractures, stress fatigue, catastrophic failure. That was a bureaucratic way of saying someone might die in a patchwork plane, and the regulations were relentless for good reason. But for the men on the line, the regulations read like a slow death. Among those men was Staff Sergeant Michael Joseph, Mickey McCarthy, an enlisted aviation ordnance specialist whose hands had been raised in grease and whose head had been filled with the mechanics of engines and the geometry of headlights from his time fixing cars back in South Boston. He had no engineering degree, no rank that demanded attention, and he joined the Marines during the hard years because steady pay and a chance to get away from the Depression seemed like sensible options. His job in VMF 213 was simple: clean the guns, load the belts, make things feed and fire when they needed to. But the job also put him in front of the films. Pilots, limited to the cockpit, could analyze the immediate. Ordnancemen were the ones who pulled cases, watched the cameras, and noticed patterns in the smoke stains on the fuselages. McCarthy started staying after shift to review gun camera footage, rewinding film and counting tracers, burst by burst, until the geometry of misses and the anatomy of hits became as familiar to him as the sound of an M2 closing. He read the technical manual until the diagrams of gun mounts and cone angles felt less like prophecy and more like a problem statement. On a humid evening in mid-September, after a flight where the squadron had watched another single zero slip through a perfectly aimed burst, McCarthy went to the armory and asked for the manual on gun harmonization. The clerk gave him the same look a lot of officers had given him his whole life, the look that translates to, "This isn't your business." McCarthy didn't need permission to read. He only needed the pages and a head willing to do the sums. He measured the wing on Captain Sweat's plane in tiny patient acts, climbing a ladder with a tape and calipers, working from memory and from geometry hammered into him by shop practice. The Corsair's 6 guns were spread across 16 feet of wing. That distance and the factory angle meant the pattern at close range was wide enough for a fighter to slip through. The math was blunt, and it hit him like cold brass. At 1,000 feet, the Zero could cover almost half the distance the bullets took to arrive. Lead calculations based on 1,000-foot convergence were compensating for a target that by the time the bullets reached that point had already moved somewhere else. He ran the numbers again, and this time the answer was scandalously simple. Move the convergence point in, dramatically in, 300 feet. At that distance, the timing would be tighter, the spread dramatically reduced, and 6 guns firing simultaneously would place an enormous concentration of kinetic force into a much smaller envelope. It would turn aimed bursts into something closer to a guarantee. There was a problem. The brackets were not designed for the acute angles that 300 feet demanded. Engineers had field-tested the mounts and warned about cracks, and the memos had an almost paternal tone of rules and caution. McCarthy, who'd never pretended to be anything more than a mechanic, looked at the mountings and saw steel. Steel could be reinforced. He saw a fix that was low-tech and ugly, but likely to work. Reinforcement gussets cut from scrap panels, welded to the mounts, and bolts locked down to maintain the steeper angle. He could make the guns point where they needed to point. He could make the structure survive recoil. He didn't file the request that the regulations required. He didn't go up the chain and wait for a committee to argue and approve. He didn't trust committees. He trusted numbers, and he trusted the men who had been dying. So after lights out on the flight line, he and 2 young ordnancemen, Eddie Wilkins and Tommy Reyes, rolled Cat & Sweat's Corsair into the hangar. They worked through the night by matchlight and the glow of a single lantern, cutting plates, filing edges, and welding reinforcement strips. McCarthy built a crude wooden jig to measure the angle, bore-sighted the guns the old way someone had taught him to aim headlights, and mounted a target frame at exactly 300 feet to test alignment. At 4 in the morning, they tested the guns into the ocean, 20 rounds apiece, watching the pattern and the mounts. The plates held. The brackets did not crack. Sweat's plane sat on the line with barrels that pointed in at a noticeably steeper angle, looking almost obscene to anyone who knew the rulebook by heart. When Sweat arrived, he saw the barrels and said what everyone would have said. That was unauthorized, that was against regulation, and that could be court-martialed work. McCarthy looked him in the eye and said the kind of short sentence men use when there's little time for politics. "If this saves lives, sir, I'll take the blame." Sweat didn't sign McCarthy's work with a signature of authority. He signed it with a tacit decision. He climbed into the cockpit and said, "Let's find out." The test was a kind of holy violence, an encounter over Empress Augusta Bay on September 19, 1943, that had begun as a routine interception, turned in a few brutal seconds into an answer that someone in the bureaucracy would come to deny and then later celebrate, depending on whether they were watching from a drawing board or from a heat-hungry cockpit. The 8 Corsairs of VMF 213 climbed on a formation of Japanese Zeros escorting bombers. The odds were poor on the map, 15 enemy aircraft to 4 interceptors. But odds mean little when geometry and intent align. Sweat dove, closing to within 300 yards, then pushed closer until the target filled the gun sight. The first 1-second burst was a compact hurricane of 50 caliber that met the Zero at nearly the moment the pilot realized what had happened. The tail folded. The fuselage came apart like cheap plywood. Another run, another short burst, wing torn free, then a canopy gone in a violent spray. The engagement was measured in seconds and in burned powder and in the stunned radio silence that came afterwards. When Sweat landed, there were men all along the line waiting to put their hands on the barrels and feel, incredulous, the tighter angle. It wasn't a miracle. It was applied trigonometry and a willingness to break a rule that had been written for a different war and a different sky. But it had an effect like a sudden weapon. VMF 213's kill count that day was catastrophic for the enemy. Ammunition expenditure per confirmed kill plummeted. Men survived missions with rounds to spare, rather than down to the last belts. The talk in the mess tents turned from numbers and memos to a single name, McCarthy, the man who had never fired the gun, but had made them kill with more economy and lethality than anyone had expected. Word spread fast, and in the way war sometimes allows, first by radio, then by rumor, and finally by the insistence of pilots who were alive because their guns could do what their hands asked. Other squadrons demanded the same angle. The Navy's intelligence picked up intercepts of Japanese radio traffic that, in translation, read like a confession of fear. The Corsairs' fire had become concentrated, a solid wall that pilots called concentrated death. Recommendations circulated. Men argued. Engineers warned that the mounts would fail if every plane adopted the steep angle. Officers who lived by paperwork raised threats of courts-martial. But the battlefield does not pay court-martials when lives hang on bullets. The squadron commander, Major Wade Britt, faced the choice of obedience to regulation or survival of his pilots. After one demonstration flight, he made a decision that read like a gamble: have McCarthy modify the whole squadron by morning. The order was an unsaid promise, the kind commanders make when they have seen the outcome and cannot justify doing otherwise. McCarthy and his crew worked through the next night until the sun broke and the tarmac smelled of fresh welds and more coffee. By dawn, every flyable Corsair in VMF 213 had been adjusted. The guns were set to converge at 300 feet. The reinforcement plates looked crude and honest, and the men who'd been tired and scared the week before now moved with a sharper, braced step. Somewhere higher up in the chain of command, someone was sketching furious, long memos. But in the lines of the hangar, the debate was settled by the sound of guns. The initial engagements after that night were not poetic. They were carnage, focused, clinical, and terrifying. Pilots who had previously complained of wasted ammunition now had a way to make every burst count. A 1-second burst at the close convergence point ceased to be a hopeful spray of tracer. It became a finite, almost surgical instrument. Japanese fighters, trained to evade at longer ranges and to bait American pilots into running out of rounds, found the rules of engagement had changed in the span of a night. And somewhere in that chain of events, an enlisted man with a hacksaw and a sense for angles had turned the Corsair from a gun that sputtered hope into a machine that delivered consequence. People would later argue about credit and protocol and the proper channels through which innovation should flow. They would write manuals that absorbed McCarthy's work as a footnote and strip his name from the drafts that migrated to Washington. But in the tent and on the line and in the leather of pilots' jackets, his name was already in the stories. Mickey McCarthy, the ordnance sergeant who had pointed the guns where they needed to be, and in doing so, changed the measure of survival for hundreds of Marines. The change was not only technical, it altered how the squadrons thought about risk, about the economy of a sortie, and about who, in the theater of war, could claim to solve a problem. It put a wrench in the hands of a mechanic and let him bend doctrine just enough to save lives. The bureaucrats who would later claim the success would call it field testing and formalize it into manuals. McCarthy would return home to Boston after the war and tell strangers in his garage that he had just loaded ammunition. Few would know the rest unless a pilot put a name together with a story in a dim mess tent and raised a glass. By the end of September, the talk was no longer anecdote, but a pattern. Pilot reports and gun camera footage stacked up, and the data spoke. Kill-to-loss ratios that had been discouraging improved dramatically. Rounds expended per kill fell. The Corsair, already a powerful fighter, had become a far more efficient one. Pilots who had been cautious found new confidence, and the Marines who had been paying for inefficiencies with lives breathed easier when the radios were silent. But the victory of the hangar wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a set of hard choices, arguments, and reckonings. Engineers would insist on long-term stress tests. Commanders would worry about precedent and discipline. And the Navy bureaucracy would look for a way to bring the fix into official procedure without crediting the sergeant who had done it in a hangar by the light of a lantern. That drama, like all bureaucratic shadows, would play out in rooms far from Bougainville. On the field, however, for the men who climbed into the cockpits and nudged throttles forward, the calculus had changed. Low-level convergence had a name now, and when the sky opened and tracers braided into a beam, it carried the echo of a night of work done by hands that did not ask for permission. The sky over Bougainville was a dim, bruised violet when the sun dipped beneath the jungle ridge. Evening breezes ghosted across the flight line, carrying the scent of salt and hot metal. The airfield looked almost peaceful from afar, a shallow sprawl of tents and pierced steel planking, surrounded by the soft roar of surf. But inside the maintenance hangars, something electric simmered beneath the hum of generators, a tension sharp enough to slice through sheet aluminum. That night, VMF 213 was supposed to be asleep, or at least pretending to be. Patrol logs were filed, aircraft reports handed in, pilots drifting toward their cots, but no one rested. The events of the morning had spread through the squadron like a brush fire. Sweat's 5 kills in a handful of seconds, the debris clouds rising like funeral pyres behind him, the impossibly tight beams of fire stitched across gun camera film. The pilot's talk wasn't casual. It carried a kind of desperate hunger. Lives had been dangling on fractions of inches and fractions of seconds for months, and suddenly, someone had found a way to shift the odds. That someone, Mickey McCarthy, worked quietly in the hangar, sleeves rolled above grease-darkened forearms. Sparks arced from a welding torch, bright blue diamonds that bit into the darkness. Sweat from the heat mixed with the grit on his face, running in muddy streaks down his cheeks. He didn't stop working. He didn't even look up when others entered. Major Britt watched from the shadows. The commanding officer's face was still, unreadable except for the faint muscle ticking at his jaw. He had made the decision that would define his career or end it. He had chosen a sergeant's ingenuity over the weight of regulations. In other places in the Pacific, men were dying because of hesitation. Britt had chosen not to wait. Corporal Eddie Wilkins hauled a crate of reinforcement plates beside McCarthy and exhaled sharply. "You ever gonna tell us how you figured this out, Sarge?" "Nope," McCarthy muttered, tightening the last bolt on the starboard mount. "Figuring doesn't matter. Doing does." Tommy Reyes, younger and wiry, with a bandana tied low on his brow to stop the sweat from tumbling into his eyes, chuckled. "That's not philosophy. That's Boston stubborn." McCarthy grunted. "Same thing." The three men worked as if machines themselves, silent, precise, efficient. The hangar smelled of burning metal, hot steel, and cordite residue. The clang of tools, the hiss of acetylene torches, and the whir of drills layered into a kind of industrial hymn. A few officers walked by and stared at the operation with equal parts awe and anxiety. Outside, Lieutenant Colonel Millington paced along the flight line like a man measuring the length of his own patience. His earlier outrage had simmered into a kind of wounded indignation. Britt's defiance wasn't simply insubordination. It was a threat to the culture he had spent a career upholding. Rules existed to prevent chaos, and here was a sergeant with a wrench given permission to rewrite them. 300 feet, he muttered, voice low and sour. Utter madness. But even he couldn't shake the memory of Sweat's calm voice hitting the radio, the incredulity dripping from each word. 1 second burst, he came apart like a matchstick. Millington stopped, massaged his temples, and stared toward the lit hangar. His fear was not that McCarthy was wrong, it was that the sergeant might be catastrophically right. Inside the hangar, sweat pooled on the floor beneath each Corsair. One by one, the aircraft rolled forward through the production line that McCarthy had improvised. Jack the wing, loosen the mounts, weld the reinforcement plate, adjust angle, bore sight, tighten the bolts, verify. 22 aircraft, 24 guns per plane, hundreds of bolts, each tightened by hand. McCarthy hardly spoke. He moved like a man guided by instinct and something deeper, a quiet rage at waste. Waste of ammo, waste of opportunity, waste of life. When the clock slid past midnight, several pilots entered, incapable of pretending to rest. Sweat was first, hair still damp from a hurried shower, flight jacket slung over one shoulder. "You sure you can get all of them done?" Sweat asked. McCarthy didn't look up. "Not sure. Doing it anyway." Sweat smiled thinly. "That's what I said before takeoff." Lieutenant Hansen stepped beside him. "And look what happened to the Japanese then." Reyes laughed as sparks showered from McCarthy's torch. "Bet they're having a very bad meeting right about now." Sweat exhaled and leaned against the wing's edge. The fresh paint smelled sharp under the heat of the lamps. He remembered the morning so vividly, he could still feel the shake of the cockpit when the first Zero exploded. It had seemed impossible, watching an enemy aircraft vanish under the weight of a single burst. But impossible things in war had a way of becoming real when necessity pressed hard enough. The pilots lingered, offering hands where they could, but mostly watching, absorbing the sight of change made real. They brought water, tools, sometimes just conversation. It didn't matter. They were witnessing something historic, even if none of them yet recognized the scale of it. The night deepened to black. The jungle hummed with insects. The airfield lights flickered in salt wind. Still, McCarthy kept going. At 3 in the morning, Lieutenant Hansen pulled up a battered stool and slumped down, rubbing his eyes. "Sarge, how long you been awake?" "Don't know. War doesn't keep time too well." Sweat stepped forward from the shadows. "Hansen, off your feet before you fall over." "Sir, just making sure the miracle man here doesn't keel over first." McCarthy smirked. "Not a miracle, math." "Same thing," Hansen said with a grin. But Britt's eyes softened. He wasn't merely watching his aircraft being altered. He was witnessing the men he commanded rediscover something they'd slowly lost: belief. Belief that survival didn't rest solely in luck or speed or prayers shouted in the cockpit. Belief that someone on the ground cared enough to risk everything to give them a fighting chance. At 4, McCarthy tested the final set of guns. They barked fire into the ocean, the muzzle flashes crackling over the waves. The recoil shuddered through the wings, but the mounts held. The pattern, even at distance, was a tight, angry knot of tracers. He lowered the barrels, satisfied. "All right," he murmured. "They're ready." Wilkins slumped against a toolbox, hair soaked. Reyes sat on the floor, panting like he'd sprinted miles. Sweat stepped forward, voice soft. "Mickey, you did it." McCarthy wiped his forehead with a rag. "Let's hope I did enough." By mid-morning, the airfield trembled with activity. Pilots strapped into fresh aircraft. Engines coughed awake, spinning propeller blades into roaring circles. The Japanese often struck just before noon, and today, the sky felt heavy with the promise of violence. Sweat taxied into line. Hansen rolled behind him. Others followed, each Corsair gleaming under the sun and carrying guns angled inward like clenched fists. In the operations tent, communications crackled. "Radar contact. Multiple bogies inbound. Estimated 20 miles. Altitude 12,000. The tension was instant. Major Britt turned toward the line of Corsairs. "Send them up. Within seconds, the first aircraft roared down the runway, tires lifting, wings cutting through humidity. The squadron soared like a blue wave into the open sky. As the Corsairs climbed, Japanese pilots approached from the north, 12 Zeros and 8 Betty bombers. Their formation was disciplined, their confidence grounded in months of baiting and exploiting American fighters whose ammunition dissolved into useless halos. One of the Zero leaders, Lieutenant Akira Ogata, had tangled with VMF 213 before. He respected American pilots' aggressiveness, but he feared nothing about their gunfire. Even their best shots rarely struck with lethal accuracy. His men had a private joke. The Corsair fires at the ocean, not the sky. But today, Ogata felt something unsettling in his gut. The American fighters climbing toward him looked the same, but their posture felt different, like predators that had suddenly remembered how to kill. Sweat saw the enemy formation glittering in sunlight. Hellhawks, form on me. Standard intercept. Pick targets. Make your shots count. But this time, Sweat wasn't worried about wasted rounds. The Corsairs sliced through the air like falling axes. Sweat broke into position behind a Zero, closing fast. The Japanese fighter jinked left, then right, expecting widespread bullets that could be danced around. Sweat held steady. He closed within 500 yards, 400, 350. The Zero pilot tucked sharply under, trying to force Sweat to fire early. Sweat didn't. He waited. 300 feet. He squeezed the trigger. The guns roared and the burst hit like a hammer dropped from heaven. The Zero didn't simply break, it ruptured. A fireball spun into a corkscrew of debris. Sweat whispered into the radio, 1. Hansen lined on a Betty bomber. He slid past its tail, dove beneath the formation, and came up at a slanted angle. The bomber's gunners opened up wildly, tracers lashing the air. Hansen closed to within lethal range. "Come on," he muttered. "Give me the line." The bomber banked, too slow. 300 feet. He fired. The Betty's right engine exploded. Flames unzipped along the fuselage. The wing folded inward like wet cardboard, and the bomber dropped with a shriek of metal. "Splash 1 Betty," Hansen called. All around the sky, something astonishing unfolded. The Zero pilots found their evasions useless. Where once they could weave through the scatter of American fire, now the bursts tore through them with terrifying precision. A pilot in the rear, attacked by Lieutenant Cross, swooped upward to avoid expected spread, only to fly directly into a condensed beam that shredded his cockpit. Another attempted a barrel roll to escape, but the burst hit with such concentrated force that his tail ripped clean off. The air smelled of burning fuel, smoke trails arcing across it like scars. Lieutenant Ogata felt panic tightening his throat. He had faced danger. He had faced death. But he had never faced this. American gunfire moved differently, not in arcs or scattered lines, but in brutal columns. He watched 3 of his wingmen vanish in less than 15 seconds. "What is this?" he whispered in Japanese. His radio crackled with frantic voices. "They're fire! Impossible! Impossible!" Ogata tried to regain control. He dove hard, pulling 5 Gs, sweat blurring into his eyes. A Corsair followed, relentless. He twisted left, expecting bullets to chase his slipstream. Instead, they met him head-on. The blast tore through his engine, and as the canopy filled with smoke, Ogata realized the Americans had changed something fundamental, something fatal. His aircraft spiraled down, swallowed by the jungle that had consumed so many stories before his. 12 minutes. That's how long the engagement lasted. 12 minutes of metal and fire, of screaming engines, and silence where men had been. When the Corsairs circled back toward Bougainville, radio chatter filled with disbelief. "Hellhawks, tally confirmed. 15 enemy aircraft destroyed. Hellhawks losses. None. Repeat, none. Sweat closed his eyes inside the cockpit and exhaled slowly. Never had he returned from combat with his heart steady enough to feel something close to relief. His ammunition gauge still sat high. He hadn't needed to empty his belts to survive. When their wheels touched down and engines powered off, the airfield erupted. Mechanics sprinted toward the landing aircraft. Pilots climbed out shaken, exhausted, alive. McCarthy stood near the hangar, arms crossed, face unreadable. He wasn't accustomed to applause, but applause found him anyway. Lieutenant Hansen strode toward him, helmet still in hand. "Sarge," he said, voice cracking with spent adrenaline, "you turn these planes into monsters." McCarthy shrugged, embarrassed. "I just tightened some bolts." Britt stepped forward. "You did more than that, Sergeant." Then, to the shock of everyone nearby, the Major offered a crisp salute. McCarthy froze. He wasn't used to being saluted by officers, certainly not by a squadron commander. Slowly, awkwardly, he returned the gesture. Sweat joined them, wiping grease from his gloves, face burned by sun and wind. "Mickey," he said sincerely, "you saved all of us." McCarthy swallowed hard. He had no answer for that. News in a war zone moves faster than airplanes. By evening, other Marine squadrons on Bougainville had heard rumors. VMF 213 had downed an entire Japanese strike group without losing a single plane. Not possible, some said. Then they saw the gun camera films. One by one, pilots, squadron commanders, and maintenance officers demanded the same modification. Requests flooded the operations tent. VMF 124 wanted it. VMF 124 wanted it. Even Navy F-6HF Hellcat squadrons asked whether the Corsair fix could be adapted to their birds. Higher command didn't know what to do. There were no protocols for this, no engineering sign-off, no authorization from the Bureau of Aeronautics, but results were impossible to argue. As one colonel in the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing muttered after watching Sweat's combat footage, "Hell with the paperwork. Get it done." Of course, not everyone celebrated. Lieutenant Colonel Millington stormed into Britt's office, face pale with suppressed fury. "You've overstepped, Major. You've allowed an enlisted man to alter aircraft structural geometry. You've jeopardized safety, and now other units are copying your recklessness." Britt leaned back in his chair, calm. "Other units are copying success." Millington slammed a folder onto the desk. "Success? One mission does not—" "It wasn't one mission. It was this morning. It was yesterday. It was every round we didn't waste and every pilot who didn't die." Millington stepped closer, voice dropping into a threat. "I'm taking this to General Geiger, and when I do, your career—" "My career," Britt snapped, standing up, "is worth far less than a single pilot's life. If Geiger wants my badge, he can have it, but he'll have to look at the casualty numbers before he asks." For the first time, Millington hesitated. Numbers were the one battlefield even bureaucrats couldn't ignore. Over the next days, McCarthy and his crew were borrowed by other squadrons. The men walked from hangar to hangar, tightening bolts, welding plates, teaching Marine and Navy ordnancemen how to adjust convergence to 300 feet safely. Men who had once dismissed him now watched every move he made. He became a ghost of the flight line, always working, always covered in welding dust, rarely speaking. The pilots spoke about him with reverence, as though he were some kind of weaponsmith from ancient legends. By the end of the month, The entire island had been transformed. From Bougainville to Guadalcanal, from Munda to the Russell Islands, fighter squadrons whispered the same phrase, 300 feet. The Japanese High Command began noticing a strange, disturbing shift in aerial engagements. Reports filtered back. American bursts now cause aircraft to explode rather than burn gradually. Enemy fire resembles a continuous beam, impossible to dodge. Recommend avoiding Corsairs at all costs. Japanese pilots who once taunted American gunfire is weak now muttered a darker phrase, Kumitsuite Shinu. To meet them is to die. They spoke about a new weapon the Americans wielded, an invisible blade hidden inside their wings. They weren't entirely wrong. But victory carried a shadow. Rumors spread that an investigation loomed, that Engineering Command in Pearl Harbor wanted answers about unauthorized modifications. McCarthy ignored the whispers. He returned to his tools, his welds, his calculations. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't chasing recognition. He didn't even seem to acknowledge the scale of what he'd done. One evening, Sweat approached him during a quiet moment on the flight line. "You know," Sweat said softly, "you might get a medal for this." McCarthy wiped his hands on a rag. "Doubt it." "You should," Sweat insisted. McCarthy shrugged. "Medals don't stop bullets. Good guns do." Sweat smiled sadly. "Mickey, you may have changed this whole war." The sergeant looked away, face shadowed. "Then let's hope the war remembers the men who actually pulled the triggers." The rain came down in soft, steady sheets the night after the second major engagement. It pattered against tent canvas, hissed in puddles along the steel-planked runway, and pooled inside every footprint as though trying to wash away the scars of combat. But even the rain couldn't silence the restless murmurs that rippled through the island. Something monumental had shifted in the Pacific. The men on Bougainville felt it before the strategists ever would. VMF 213 pilots lay in their cots listening to distant thunder, replaying dogfights in the darkness. Mechanics sat together under tin awnings, smoking cigarettes until the filters died. Even junior officers walked around with a jolt of nervous joy, unable to suppress the strange sensation of hope, a dangerous thing in war. Hope had a name now. 300 feet. The rain drummed on the rooftops as messages crackled across field radios and command channels. The Japanese had been routed twice in 2 days. Marine fighters had achieved kill numbers previously thought impossible without losing a single pilot. In the operations tent, Britt sat across from an intelligence officer who had arrived only hours earlier, his uniform soaked from the downpour. He placed a folder on the table. "Intercepts from Rabaul, sir." Britt opened the folder. Inside were typed translations of Japanese transmissions recovered by Naval Signals Intelligence. One line stood out. "American Corsairs have changed their method of attack. Do not attempt evasive maneuvers inside 200 meters. Their fire becomes fatal." Britt exhaled slowly. "They know. They know," the intelligence officer repeated. "But they don't understand." Britt closed the folder. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. The Japanese command would search for explanations in pilot skill, new ammunition, new formations. They wouldn't imagine that a mechanic with a welding torch had outthought their entire operational doctrine. The spread begins. By the next morning, the rain had burned off beneath a searing tropical sun. The sky was a relentless blue, the runway shimmering with trapped heat. Even before first light, Other units had arrived from across the island, trudging toward VMF 213's hangar like pilgrims. VMF 124 showed up first. Their maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Avery Collins, marched toward Britt and saluted. "Sir, my CO requests that Sergeant McCarthy instruct my men immediately." "Request granted," Britt said without hesitation. Collins exhaled in relief, then turned and barked orders. His ordnance men unloaded crates of tools, set up welders, and cleared an entire bay. They had come not just to modify their guns, but to witness the man behind the method. Hansen leaned toward Sweat as they watched the procession. "Feels like we're running a school." Sweat nodded. "A school that saves lives." And more squadrons kept coming. VMF 221 arrived with 19 Corsairs. VMF 214, the infamous Black Sheep, arrived with 23. Then the Navy pilots showed up. Hellcats rolled across the field, their pilots hopping down and wandering toward McCarthy as though approaching a myth. They brought photos, measurements, diagrams. They asked if McCarthy's solution could adapt to their mounts. McCarthy barely looked up from his welder. "Get the planes lined up, we'll find out." For 3 consecutive days, the hangars of Bougainville roared with sparks and grinding steel. Torches burned blue into the night. The sound never stopped. Welding, drilling, testing, firing. McCarthy became the quiet center of a storm he had never asked for. Officers from various squadrons took notes, but often their technical questions were met with shrugs. "It's just angles," McCarthy would say. "Keep the recoil balanced, reinforce your mounts, the rest is common sense." To the officers, that wasn't an explanation, it was wizardry. By the second day, young mechanics were mimicking him, measuring angles with makeshift jigs. Hardened armorers from other islands whispered that the sergeant from South Boston had the hands of a blacksmith and the mind of an engineer. Word spread beyond Bougainville, across the Solomon Chain, at barracks on Guadalcanal, at humid airstrips on New Georgia, even aboard carriers threading the Coral Sea. Pilots murmured the same 2 words with growing excitement: McCarthy fix. Some said it like a blessing, others like a secret. Commanders began sending frantic requests for diagrams, instructions, field manuals. But there were none. The modification existed only in the calloused hands of a sergeant. That was both the miracle and the problem. 900 miles away, in a command bunker in Rabaul, Japanese aviation officers pored over combat reports from recent losses. The casualty lists were staggering. Entire bomber formations erased. Veteran Zero pilots lost in seconds. Survivors describing bursts of fire too dense to evade. Commander Minoru Takata rubbed his forehead with trembling fingers. "This cannot be natural. Americans have found something." His deputy nodded. "Pilot skill cannot explain this many losses. Their guns..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Their guns act like new weapons." Takata shook his head. "Impossible. Americans lack the finesse for such precision." But even he didn't believe that lie anymore. While the Japanese reeled from confusion, the Americans reeled from politics. Word of McCarthy's modification reached the Marine Aircraft Wing headquarters and soon after reached Pearl Harbor. The Bureau of Aeronautics, the very institution that had once declared sub-500-foot convergence structurally unsafe, was suddenly aware that dozens of Corsairs had been altered in violation of explicit orders, and they were not happy. Lieutenant Colonel Millington, humiliated by the results, seized the opportunity. He marched into Britt's office carrying a new stack of papers. "You're done, Major. Direct orders from Group. A formal inquiry begins tomorrow morning." Britt didn't flinch. An inquiry? Modification of federally owned aircraft without authorization. Endangerment of personnel. Violation of technical specifications." Millington's voice trembled with vindication. "And I will see to it that Sergeant McCarthy is held accountable." Sweat, who had been leaning against the wall, stiffened. "Sir, with respect." "No, Captain. Respect is exactly what your unit has lacked." He slammed the papers onto Britt's desk. "This madness ends now." Britt opened the papers slowly, but instead of shock, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Millington faltered. "Is something amusing, Major?" Britt looked up. "I believe you should read the bottom of this memo." Millington snatched it back and scanned downward. His eyes bulged. At the bottom, beneath the list of violations, was a simple line. "However, all modified aircraft are to remain operational pending further results due to significant improvements in combat efficacy." Signed, Major General Roy S. Geiger. Millington's mouth fell open. This can't be correct." "It is," Britt said. "General Geiger wants to speak to Sergeant McCarthy personally." Millington looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. McCarthy wiped his hands nervously as Britt escorted him into the operations tent where General Geiger stood, his uniform crisped despite the humidity. The general's expression was stern but curious, the look of a man who had commanded Marines in 2 wars and recognized ingenuity when he saw it. "So," Geiger began, "you're the sergeant who's been causing me a political headache." McCarthy swallowed. "Yes, sir." The general studied him for a moment. "Tell me, Sergeant, why did you make this modification?" The room waited. Sweat and Hansen stood in the back, tense. Millington watched with tight lips. McCarthy shifted his weight. "Because pilots were dying, sir. Because the guns weren't hitting what they were pointed at." "Why not request approval?" "No time, sir." "What if you had been wrong?" McCarthy met his gaze. "Then I'd accept the consequences, but doing nothing was worse." Silence. Finally, Geiger nodded. "Good answer." Millington nearly choked. Geiger stepped closer. "Sergeant, I've seen the gun camera footage. I've seen the casualty reports. And I've read the intercepted Japanese messages. Your modification may have altered the entire air campaign over the Solomons." McCarthy stared at the ground. "Sir, You saved lives," Geiger said bluntly. "Hundreds." He turned to Britt. "Major, continue the modification across the wing. Quietly. I'll deal with the bureaucracy." Britt saluted. Millington sputtered. "General!" "Colonel Millington," Geiger said firmly, "you will support this initiative, or you will be reassigned to clerical duty on Hawaii. Am I clear?" Millington snapped to attention, face burning red. "Crystal, sir." The weeks that followed transformed the war in the Solomons. Pilots who had averaged 2 or 3 kills in months suddenly began reporting multiple victories in single engagements. The tighter convergence sharpened tactics, emboldened maneuvers, and restored confidence long eroded by frustration. Lieutenant Robert Hansen became one of the fiercest predators the Pacific had seen. In dogfights, he moved with icy precision. His bursts dissected enemy aircraft mid-turn. Sweet continued rising as well, not through recklessness, but through calm, deliberate mastery. His bursts were short, efficient, devastating. Other pilots rapidly joined their ranks. Lieutenant Earl Davis, 2 kills in 4 months, scored 9 in 12 days. Sergeant-turned-pilot Lanny Brewster downed 4 Betty bombers in a single sortie. VMF 213's scoreboard outside the ready tent quickly filled, then overflowed. Wooden slats had to be added to track the rising tally. The squadron's reputation spread so widely that Navy pilots, Marines, and even Army Air Forces personnel referred to them with a new nickname, the Hammer Line, because their fire no longer scattered, it struck like a single blow. In Rabaul, reports from field commanders grew desperate. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima wrote, "Corsair firepower is no longer human. Their guns create a wall of destruction. Standard evasive maneuvers are ineffective. Recommend immediate review of tactics." Another report read, "If intercepted by Corsairs, order pilots to disengage. If unable, ram the enemy. Death is better than certain destruction." Japanese pilots themselves coined a chilling new phrase, Shinigami no Hana, the Grim Reaper's bloom. They used it to describe the sudden eruption of flame when a Corsair's 300-foot burst struck home. While pilots rose to fame, while reports circulated, while admirals whispered about tactical revolutions, the man responsible for all of it remained in the shadows of the hangars. McCarthy worked constantly, reinforcing more mounts, teaching new teams, testing angles. His hands blistered, his knuckles split. He slept in shifts, collapsing between wings and tool crates. Sometimes, late at night, pilots found him sitting alone beside a half-finished mount, staring at it as though it held questions only he could hear. Sweat approached him once, noticing the exhaustion etched into his face. "You look like you're breaking yourself," Sweat said. McCarthy shrugged. "Work's not done, never is. You don't have to fix every plane in the Pacific yourself. Someone does." McCarthy rarely accepted credit. He rarely spoke of pride. But once, when Reyes joked that the war might end before they ran out of weld wire, McCarthy paused. "If it ends sooner," he said softly, "good." And they all understood what he meant. By November, Marine air squadrons across the South Pacific had reversed the balance of air power. Missions that once ended in Pyrrhic victories now ended with decisive dominance. Carrier groups in the region began requesting Corsair support more frequently. Attempted Japanese raids collapsed before they reached their targets. And American commanders noticed something remarkable. Morale across the Pacific surged. Men who had once trudged resignedly into their cockpits now walked with new purpose. Engineers at Pearl Harbor conducted stress tests and sent back an official interim report, "Structural integrity acceptable." Bureau of Aeronautics officers who had once dismissed the idea scrambled to update manuals. One captain joked, "We're rewriting doctrine faster than McCarthy rewrites his brackets." The men of VMF 213 never said it aloud, but they felt it. They were part of something historic. Not a weapon, not a tactic, a moment. In the ready room, pilots gathered before missions, writing last letters, tightening harness straps. But there was a different air about it now. Less dread, more resolve. They believed they would come back. They believed because their guns no longer betrayed them. And because somewhere behind the hangars, a sergeant with no college degree and no engineering training was still adjusting the angles of fate. The nights on Bougainville were rarely quiet anymore. Not because of gunfire, that had grown strangely distant, but because the island itself hummed with a new kind of energy, a sense of acceleration, advancement, momentum. The war was turning, and everyone felt it in the air like static before a storm. Pilots walked differently now. Mechanics joked differently. Radios carried different tones. For the first time since the dark weeks after Guadalcanal, Marines dared to say the forbidden words, "We're winning." But the truth of why they were winning, why engagements that once drained ammunition now ended in mere seconds, was still known to only a few. And one of them walked alone behind the hangars, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hands permanently blackened with grease and weld dust. Sergeant Mickey McCarthy, the quiet, unassuming ordnanceman whose idea had spread across the Pacific, sat on a wooden crate watching the sun crawl upward over the ocean. He looked older than his years now, Not physically, though his face was more lined and his eyes held permanent fatigue, but spiritually, like someone who had stared too long into the machinery of war and understood both its cruelty and its rules. Hansen approached with 2 tin mugs of lukewarm coffee. "Sun's not up yet," he said. McCarthy grunted softly. "Thought I beat it." "You can't beat the sun," Hansen said, sitting beside him. "Believe me, we've tried." McCarthy took the coffee with a nod. They sat for a moment listening to the surf crash against the shore. "You know," Hansen said quietly, "some folks think we'll push right through Rabaul because of what you started." McCarthy shrugged. "Pilots pull the trigger. That's who wins wars, not welders." "Funny, every pilot I know says the opposite." McCarthy didn't respond. Compliments rolled off him like rain off a tarp. He had made peace with anonymity long ago. By early December, the newly modified Corsairs and Hellcats had rewritten the rules of air combat. Where engagements once unfolded like chess, positioning, patience, slow maneuver, they now erupted like avalanches. A squadron of 24 Marines would dive into a Japanese formation, and within a minute, aircraft began to disappear. Not trail smoke, not limp downward in flames. Disappear, torn apart by concentrated bursts of .50 caliber fire that hit like the blow of a sledgehammer. Reports poured in from every island. Quote, 4 Zeros destroyed in 9 seconds. Quote, Betty bomber evaporated under a single burst. Quote, entire fighter escort neutralized. One unit intercepted a bomber group over Kahili and wiped out 15 aircraft in less than 2 minutes. 27 American fighters returned home. Not one had been lost. This wasn't simply improved accuracy. It was a shift in the psychology of battle. Before the modification, Marine pilots entered dogfights with clenched teeth, knowing survival meant outturning, outdiving, or outpraying the enemy. Now the advantage was theirs, and it wasn't subtle. Pilots described the feeling the first time they squeezed the trigger at 300 feet. It felt like holding a rail gun. It was like the wings became cannons. Everything shook, but the enemy shook more. It was the kind of power that could make men reckless, but these pilots were too experienced to be reckless. They were simply efficient. The sky belonged to them. In Rabaul, the panic hardened into strategy. Commander Takata assembled senior officers in a concrete bunker lit by flickering lanterns. The room smelled of sweat, kerosene, and quiet dread. Our pilots report that American fighters destroy at impossible ranges, Takata said. Their bursts are focused. Their convergence is unnatural. One officer stepped forward. We recommend immediate dispersion tactics, no more tight formations, encourage pilots to spread and dive. Another shook his head. We've already tried. The Corsairs close distance before we can adjust. Their bursts reach us in the narrowest window. A third suggested reinforcing vital areas of the Zeros with additional armor plating. Takata slammed his fist on the table. No, if we add weight, the Zero loses its only advantage, maneuverability. Silence. They had no solution. American bursts, once considered clumsy and easy to dodge, now landed with a surgeon's precision. Japanese pilots began calling the converged guns the American Dragon's Breath. Those who survived encounters spoke with hollow voices. It strikes from nowhere. You see him, then you are hit. There is no warning, no escape. The Zero pilots, once the terror of the Pacific, now faced an enemy whose gunfire behaved like a weapon out of myth. December 1943. The Japanese launched their largest air counteroffensive in months, a mass strike intended to shatter American forces around Empress Augusta Bay. Radar screens lit up as the wave approached. 53 Zeros, 12 bombers, 100 miles out. VMF 213 scrambled immediately. Sweat led the formation, his squadron slicing upward like steel blue arrows. As they closed distance, radio chatter filled the air. "Keep it tight, we're outnumbered. Stay calm." But Sweat's voice came in steady, composed. "We've been here before. Only difference, today we're ready." The battle exploded into chaos. Zeros poured down from above, the same tactics that once devastated Marine squadrons. But when the Corsairs fired, Japanese pilots died before they understood what hit them. Hansen downed 2 aircraft in a 6-second window. Davis intercepted a bomber and shredded its belly in a single burst. Sweat dove into a swarm of Zeros and came out with 3 confirmed kills. The sky roared with the thunder of close-range gunfire, deep, violent, decisive. Marine pilots later described the engagement as a slaughterhouse in the clouds. 28 Japanese aircraft fell. Only 1 Marine Corsair took damage, a glancing hit, nothing serious. The Japanese offensive collapsed. The air war in the Solomons had effectively ended. But victories, no matter how brilliant, extract a price. In the weeks following the battles, McCarthy's health began to falter. He wasn't wounded, not in the way pilots were, but exhaustion ate at him relentlessly. His hands trembled while tightening bolts. His eyelids drooped mid-sentence. Some nights, he slept beside the wings he worked on because he couldn't make it back to his tent. Britt noticed. Sweat noticed. Hansen noticed. One evening, after a long day of modifications, Britt approached him. "Sergeant, stop." McCarthy didn't look up. He kept filing a bracket, each scrape of metal sounding like the ticking of a time bomb. "Sergeant," Britt repeated, firmer this time. "That's an order." McCarthy froze. Sweat stepped forward gently. "Mickey, let it rest. These planes can fly without you for one night." McCarthy's voice cracked. "What if they can't?" Sweat placed a hand on his shoulder. "They can, because of you." McCarthy stared at the ground. Then, with great reluctance, as though surrendering a weapon, he set the wrench down. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept deeply. By early 1944, Japanese command recognized a grim truth. The Corsair had become the most dominant fighter in the Pacific. Its pilots were too skilled, its structure too rugged, its firepower too lethal. Desperation bred new tactics. The Japanese ordered a last-ditch measure, ramming attacks. Pilots were instructed to close with American fighters and, if outmaneuvered, sacrifice their aircraft to cripple the enemy. It was a brutal command, a tragic one. Reports reached Bougainville from intelligence intercepts. Enemy pilots instructed to use body of plane as weapon. Even McCarthy looked shaken reading that. But when these ramming attempts were carried out in the field, they failed. Because in order to ram a Corsair, you had to get within 300 feet. And within 300 feet, Marines were unbeatable. The attempts collapsed in fireballs long before impact. With Japanese resistance fading, VMF 213 rotated rearward for rest and reorganization. Pilots boarded transports, looking gaunt, victorious, and strangely empty, as if unsure whether they wanted celebration or sleep. In the airfield's administrative building, Britt prepared commendation lists. Dozens of pilots were nominated for medals, citations, and promotions. Sweat earned one, Hansen another. Davis received a citation. Even Wilkins and Reyes were recommended for commendation for their role in assisting modifications. The only name missing from all paperwork was McCarthy's. Britt marched straight to the reviewing officer. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," the officer replied dryly. "Washington does not recognize unauthorized modifications." Britt stiffened. "Sir, that modification saved more lives than any official program this year." "I don't doubt it, but the Corps can't reward actions that violated regulation." "Then court-martial me," Britt said quietly. The officer sighed. "Major, there are things we can change and things we cannot. This is one of the latter." Britt clenched his jaw. "It's wrong." "Yes," the officer said, "but it is still the rule." Britt didn't want to tell McCarthy. He dreaded it. He rehearsed the words. "You've been denied official recognition. I'm sorry." And each time the words tasted bitter. But when the moment came, McCarthy simply nodded. "I figured as much." "That doesn't make it right," Britt said, anger in his voice. McCarthy shrugged gently. "Sir, medals don't matter." "You deserve one," Britt insisted. "Maybe," McCarthy said softly, "but the pilots flew. They're the ones who risked their lives, not me." Britt stared at him. "You changed the war, Sergeant." "No," McCarthy replied. "The war changed because Marines don't quit. I just kept the bolts tight so they could win." Britt couldn't speak, because somehow in that moment, the sergeant seemed larger than any medal. 3 months later, McCarthy rotated home. There was no ceremony, no farewell parade, just handshakes, claps on the back, and a long line of pilots who wanted to thank him personally. When he boarded the transport ship, Sweat was the last to say goodbye. "You saved my life," Sweat said quietly. McCarthy gave the faintest smile. "You saved mine too, every time you came back." "Take care of yourself, Mickey." "You too, Lieutenant." And with that, the man whose wrench had altered the course of a war stepped on to the gangway and vanished into the morning fog. After the war, official histories credited improved tactics, pilot skill, and superior aircraft design for the shift in the Pacific Air War. In footnotes, tiny, overlooked footnotes, researchers occasionally found mentions of field modifications to gun convergence performed by Marine Ordnance personnel. Most readers skipped it. A few didn't. Those who dug deeper found that the modification had been initiated not by a high-level engineer, not by a decorated pilot, not by a general, but by an enlisted sergeant. A sergeant whose name never made it into the official textbooks. But among the pilots who fought, among the Marines who lived because rounds hit where they were meant to, McCarthy's name carried weight. He would never know how many lives he saved. He would never know how many Japanese pilots survived because his modification ended battles faster, with less suffering. He would never know how many historians quietly acknowledged him decades later. But maybe that was fitting. McCarthy was not a man who lived for glory. He lived for doing things right. Years later, long after the war ended, Sweat attended a reunion of VMF 213 pilots. They drank, laughed, retold stories, and teased each other about kills that grew larger with every decade. Then the room grew quiet. Someone asked, "Whatever happened to McCarthy?" Sweat paused, staring into his glass. "He went home, lived a quiet life. No interviews, no bragging, no medals, just faded into peace." "Doesn't seem fair," another pilot murmured. "No," Sweat agreed. "It doesn't." He lifted his glass. "To the man who fixed the guns, Glasses lifted across the room to McCarthy. And in that moment, held aloft in the trembling hands of men who owed their lives to him, the sergeant finally received the recognition history had denied. Epilogue. The sky remembers. If you stand on the old airfield at Bougainville long enough, you can still hear the echoes. Not of engines, not of gunfire, but of something deeper. The ghosts of men whose courage, intellect, and sweat shaped the sky itself. Among those voices, if you listen closely, you might hear the ring of a wrench hitting steel. A reminder that sometimes the greatest changes in history come not from the battlefield, but from the quiet labor of a man who believed things could be better. A man who tightened bolts, adjusted angles, refused to accept failure, and in doing so, helped turn the war.